Well, Sam, congratulations on Homecoming, which is your new show on Amazon. Coming off of Mr. Robot, of course, which you've been working on for the last few years, and will be working on to conclude. What made you interested in Homecoming, this story, this podcast, that you wanted to make this into a show?
I think, honestly, when I listened to the podcast, it was new and old-fashioned at the same time. And what I mean by that is that it just harkened back to these kind of more old-school thrillers that I used to watch growing up. And I feel like nowadays when I watch thrillers, they tend to be actual, like, action movies with some twists in between set pieces. But here was a character-based thriller about people and like these sort of intimate settings, and that these sort of relationships end up being the real twists and turns. And so that was it, for me. It was just like an opportunity to kind of do a throwback to those classic thrillers I enjoyed.
And there's a bit of a similarity in that, you're in both shows you're dealing with a little bit of an unreliable character sometimes, a little bit of an uncertain reality, which gives you opportunities to kind of play around with directing, with style, with conveying these kinds of unusual points of view. What's that like as a director to kind of, is it like a director's playground?
I mean, I would say yes and no. I mean, it's never conscious to. It's never like a conscious decision that I'm seeking out this sort of unreliable storytelling. It's just something that I think when I think about it, it resonates, and maybe it's just what's going on in the world right now that we're feeling this sort of unreliability with our world and our reality and our society. But in terms of storytelling and specifically filmmaking, there is a lot of like fertile ground there, because I don't think it's been really tapped into as much as it has been and is going to continue to in the next few years. So there is something about really kind of uncorking that and finding new inventive ways to move the camera around and really get inside someone's head.
And you're also dealing with these kind of institutional conflicts, the corruption in finance or government, or in case of Homecoming, a lot of the military-industrial complex. How is the real world kind of upheaval, political and social? Has that affected your work as a director and a storyteller?
Of course. I mean, I'm constantly inspired by the things that are going around me. I think that it would be silly to try and discount that. I mean, I think, again, it goes back to that earlier question. It feels like a subconscious thing. There's something about it that resonates. And I know when they did Mr. Robot, there were these elements about technology and about the sort of increased surveillance state, the sort of side effect of technology, that made kind of the bedrock of that paranoia in Mr. Robot. And then when we kind of released the show, lo and behold, I think everybody was kind of having that sense. And here with Homecoming, I felt it with the podcast that are we sort of this relationship with our government and pharmaceuticals, and how are they testing things, and are they being upfront, and then is it even like the things they're testing for, specifically in our show, PTSD or trauma in general, is that even a moral thing to do to evaporate it like that? There's just something about it in the air that's really resonant right now.
And the Homecoming facility plays a big part in this show. That setting can be a little claustrophobic and a little uneasy. These soldiers are kind of in a place they're not familiar with. What was it like creating that world, that physical space, and what were the most important aspects?
I mean, it was really fun. I mean, I think the knee-jerk reaction when you listened to the podcast was that you imagined a building with white walls, and it was really sanitized and clinical. But then I think what was really creative about what the writers did, and then what my production designer Anastasia did, was to kind of flip that on its head, where if you have a corporation that's actually trying to be more seductive with their facilities, that's invested in trying to keep things from the soldiers, they wouldn't make it so clinical. They would do their version of homey or hip, and they would turn this awkward office building into this kind of dorm, and with bad art and just weird stylistic choices, as if they're trying to essentially sell the soldiers that this could be like you're going back to home. And there's something about that slightly off-kilter feel to it that actually makes it more sinister than what you would typically see as like a white-walled clinical institution.
And you're working with Julia Roberts, of course, who is the star of the series and producer. She's done a little TV here and there, but not primarily known for it. Not for something this long form, certainly. What was it like working with her in front of the camera and behind the camera?
I mean, it's exactly, I think, what you would expect. It's amazing. It's like just having an ace up your sleeve. She's operating at such a high level of skill. She comes in so prepared. Nothing is taken for granted, and she keeps the scene alive. And at every turn. I mean, even when she doesn't have any dialogue. There are just those moments in between her lines that she really just she lights up the camera, and she really makes these really specific, granular choices, and that's really freeing as a director because I can just give her a bunch of shit to do constantly. And she just can juggle them all, and then I can also give her notes on top of that, and she'll not only do that, but then kind of, elevate it to another level that I didn't even expect. So it's just it's been phenomenal working with her, to say the least.
And the relationship that she forms with one of the soldiers, played by Stephan James, is another central aspect of the show. What's it like directing those two together in those scenes where they're generating that rapport, but there's also this kind of tension? Of course, there are things that he doesn't know that she knows.
Yeah, well, it's just Stephan was just an incredible find. I mean, I don't even take credit for finding him, because he was literally shooting Beale Street while we were auditioning for this part, and he somehow found some time to send us a tape. And I remember watching his audition tape, and I couldn't take my eyes off of him. I'm not really a fan of watching auditions on tape in general, but there's just something magnetic about him. In fact, I think I watched the audition tape without the sound on, and there's so much storytelling in his face and what he's doing with his expressions, and there's just a really non-cynical earnestness to him that's really rare. And so when we brought him out to do the chemistry read with Julia, and the guy, at the time he was 23, he's sitting there opposite Julia Roberts, and he doesn't blink. He's completely comfortable, completely charming and charismatic. And typically, when you do those scenes with an audition like that, usually actors have their sides in their hands. It's more like a safety net. That they're typically off book, but I saw the two of them just sort of lower their sides as the scene went on, and it was honestly like we were literally watching a real life conversation between two people. They just had such extraordinary chemistry that when it came time to shoot those scenes, I just tried to stay out of their way as much as possible.
In the show, there's a mystery to it that incorporates a couple of different time periods. What was your approach to kind of differentiating that and making that storytelling as clear, but also as mysterious as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly didn't feel as a director that I needed to do anything to indicate to the audience the shifting timelines. I feel like audiences now are sophisticated enough. There's enough movies and television shows that employ that device that I didn't think it was necessary to actually do anything overt. But then I go ahead and do that anyway, right? Because I have the aspect ratio in the 2022 storyline, the sort of 1-to-1 box ratio. But that all kind of came from Heidi, from her character, and that's one thing Todd and I tend to, whenever we sit down to talk about the sort of the visual style of the show, we always start with the character and their point of view and what they're going through. And in 2022, Heidi, she is sort of downtrodden, defeated. She's lost her job. She's working as a waitress. So the lighting is a little flatter, the colors are a little more desaturated, but more importantly, she doesn't remember everything, and she doesn't have the full picture. And so we thought that aspect ratio kind of shrinks her point of view and shrinks her world and gives her this narrow, limited scope of what she actually can understand about what's going on. And then as she's getting pursued by Carrasco and Colin, it's almost like she's cornered and boxed in. And so for all those reasons, we felt that that aspect ratio really worked for that storyline. And then in the 2018 storyline, conversely, we have the full picture. The lighting's a little more dramatic, it's a little more saturated, because Heidi is on the upswing, she's started a new career, she's in charge. So that's kind of, again, those are the things that really drive how we film the show.
And you've had such a unique kind of visual sensibility on your shows. What have been some of your influences, some of your inspirations that have kind of contributed to how you tell stories?
Well, I'm a film nerd. I mean, I try and watch something at least once a day, whether it's an episode of television or a film. So I have a lot of influences, and it'd probably take too long to name them all right now. But I will say for Homecoming specifically, the masters of thrillers that I was obsessed with growing up, whether it's Friedkin or Pakula or De Palma or Hitchcock, Kubrick. I mean, I can rattle a bunch of those guys off too. But honestly, it was just that kind of a throwback to those 70s paranoid thrillers, those old school 50s, 60s thrillers, and then some of the early 80s. I mean, I know that De Palma was such a huge influence in the way we did kind of those long takes and shooting like the top-down shots where we kind of put the soldiers and Heidi under a microscope. So a lot of those are the guys that really inspired us.
And you were working on Mr. Robot as well as Homecoming. Has it been a challenge to balance, or has there been a very clear kind of scheduled breaks in between at all?
I mean, no, it's been an utter challenge to balance, to the point where I had to delay Mr. Robot a year to do Homecoming. I don't have that. I don't know what it is, the aptitude that some of these other great showrunners out there that can juggle 3 or 4 shows simultaneously. I kind of have to, and because I direct them all, I kind of have to be more laser focused on each one at a time.
What was that scheduling like over the past year or so?
Well, I mean, honestly, one of the things when I started to do Homecoming, I was only going to do the first 2 episodes because I had to go back onto Mr. Robot. But it was Julia that sort of insisted that I do the whole season, because coming from the future world, she wasn't used to this concept of a different director coming in every week. And actually, I kind of related to her on that, because on Mr. Robot, from the others, from the behind the camera, I felt the same way. I wasn't used to having to kind of bring on another person and direct something direct another chapter every week. There's just something about that doesn't mentally compute with me. So because of that, we kind of delayed Mr. Robot for a year so that I could go off and really focus on Homecoming.
And making Homecoming is based on a podcast, and Mr. Robot was an original concept. How's it different, kind of working with material that has come from another source outside of yourself?
Well, look, I don't think it's a secret that I'm kind of very controlling in my creative vision. So, but the great thing is that Eli and Micah were really great collaborators, and because I was such a fan of the podcast, there wasn't even a question. I mean, I didn't even. There was never a point where I said, well, I need to take over writing duties and adapt it. I specifically wanted them to come on board as writers and as the showrunners, as the proper showrunners, because I really wanted to retain what they did in the podcast so well. And then we collaborated, and it was great. It was a great experience, and I think that's the thing about. I mean, my whole creative team for Mr. Robot came over to Homecoming. My costume designer Kat, who's brilliant, my production designer Anastasia White, and my DP Todd Campbell. So it's been great to just have this team, and now these great writers to collaborate on and lean on.
And with Mr. Robot coming back for one last season, did you always have a particular endpoint in mind for that show? Or
I did, and I'm lucky enough to have this tremendous support at USA and UCP, because it's for them to sort of honor the track that I wanted to be on, and let me sort of finish the story on my own terms. It's I've been really lucky to just have such and they waited. I mean, not only did they wait for Homecoming, but they waited for me to sort of figure out, because at the end of season 3, I've always known the ending, but I just never knew how many episodes exactly that it would take to get there. So at the end of season 3, I kind of went into the writer's room and just figured out that number, and then told USA and UCP that number, and they said okay, and it was one more season, and so it's just great to have that kind of support. I'm really lucky in that regard.
I have a theory that at the end of Mr. Robot, it'll turn out that Alf was really behind everything. Will we see Alf again?
This is a no spoiler zone, so I will plead the fifth on that.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Congratulations on both shows, and best of luck on
Thank you.
Homecoming as it comes out.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.